Dr. Ian Lipkin is the world's most famous virologist. Head of Columbia University's Center for Infection and Immunity, Dr. Lipkin acquired global repute when he acted as the chief scientific consultant for the Hollywood film Contagion. He was one of the first doctors to come on India Today on the 4th of March to warn of the dangers of COVID-19. At that time, when he spoke of wearing masks and gloves, a lot of people thought he was being paranoid. 3 weeks after he came on India Today, Dr. Ian Lipkin himself tested positive for COVID-19. That's when everyone thought, if he can get coronavirus, none of us are safe. He's had a tough few days and is now on the path of a slow recovery. A lot of what he said last time has come true over the past 1 month, and I'm very curious to know where Dr. Ian Lipkin thinks the world's battle against coronavirus is going next. Dr. Ian Lipkin, for joining us for your first interview after your recovery, thank you very much and a warm welcome.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Before I speak to Dr. Ian Lipkin, I want to show you excerpts of what Dr. Lipkin said to us earlier, get a sense of where he's coming from, his journey, and then we'll ask the world's foremost, why all of us, you and I, over the next several weeks.
World-renowned epidemiologist Dr. Ian Lipkin was the medical consultant on the film. Ironically, the global virus hunter revealed in March that he had tested positive for the novel coronavirus. With over 30 years of experience in diagnostics, microbial discovery and outbreak response, Dr. W. Ian Lipkin is internationally recognized as an authority on the use of molecular methods for pathogen discovery. So it's no wonder then that he flew to China to investigate the outbreak of the coronavirus disease, now known as COVID-19. Dr. Lipkin had traveled to China earlier this year to consult with local health officials on their response to the coronavirus outbreak and quarantined himself for 14 days in February after returning to the US just to make sure he was not sick. In his 3-decade-long career, Dr. Lipkin has many path-breaking firsts to his name. And over the years, he and his team have discovered or characterized more than 500 infectious agents, including the Borna disease virus, West Nile virus, Lujo virus, and human rhinovirus C. Dr. Lipkin assisted the WHO and the People's Republic of China during the 2003 SARS outbreak and currently advises the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in addressing the challenge of MERS, the 2 other types of coronavirus outbreaks that in the past decade or so have spread to different parts of the world. Bureau Report, India Today.
Dr. Ian Lipkin, welcome to India Today. We're privileged to have you with us. You're just bouncing back from COVID-19 yourself. I want to start by asking you, I hope you're well, I hope you're recovering well.
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Can you describe to our viewers your own experience of fighting the coronavirus?
I began with a typical presentation. I developed fever, cough, I had a headache for 2 days that was somewhat disabling, and I had a persistent cough that lasted for almost 2 weeks. But I had one evening I had shortness of breath, but for the most part I was spared, some of the respiratory compromise that many people have, fortunately.
Have you had an opportunity to reflect on how you contacted the virus? I was watching your last interview with India Today. You spoke of taking extreme precautions. Even at that time, you were talking about wearing gloves, wearing masks, and then next we know you're in the headlines because you got the virus yourself.
Yes, well, one of the issues when you start doing media is that you sometimes find yourself in studios where the hygiene is less than optimal. And my hunch is that that's probably, it was on one of those trips in New York that I encountered the virus, because I certainly did not get sick in China. And when I had control over my environment, I think I was fine. But it is important that people take into consideration the various ways in which you can prevent yourself from becoming infected. And the cast of Contagion issued some public service announcements a few weeks ago that I hope your listeners and your viewers have seen, because there's a lot of useful information there. You can access those public service announcements by Kate Winslet, Lawrence Fishburne, Matt Damon, Jennifer Ely from the website we have at Columbia University. Center for Infection and Immunity. And they're very nice. They're little 3-minute sketches that tell you how to protect yourself. It's quite useful.
We'll certainly take a look at it. There are different options and different lines of treatment that are available. I was reading that you self-prescribed hydroxychloroquine. Of all the lines of treatment which were available, why did you not go to a hospital? Why did you prescribe HCQ?
So this is not something that I prescribe for myself. But although I'm a physician and I do prescribe, I don't self-prescribe. The infectious disease physician who was assigned to me felt strongly that this was something that we should do. He consulted with my cardiologists, found that there was no impediment to doing so. My family wanted me to do this, and so it was the path of least resistance. I don't think that it had any impact on my clinical course, but I don't know that for sure. In fact, we are now supporting a clinical trial of hydroxyquinoline with azithromycin. I did not take azithromycin to see whether or not, in fact, it has any impact. So it has, hypothetically, there's reason to believe that it might have value, but it's not yet proven.
Now, what's your own sense? Because there are some research studies that say that HCQ is most certainly having an effect on COVID-19 patients, and there's a lot of studies that say that it's not having any impact. I want to understand from you, as the world's #1 disease control expert, what's your view, sir?
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm the #1 anything except being me. But that said, I don't have any double-blinded studies where neither the patient nor the physician or the nurse knows what is being given to the patient. This is the classic way in which we sort out what's real and what is fantasy. And although, as I say, there's some hypothetical reasons to suggest that the drug might have value, it has not been proven yet to have value. That's not the same thing as saying that it doesn't have value. I'm simply saying that I am agnostic. We don't yet know. So we are running these kinds of trials now all over the world. And there are some very strong proponents for this. One of them is the President of the United States. Another is a physician in Marseille who proposed this. Again, I don't know that it has effect.
You're also a big advocate of plasma therapy.
Yes.
What is it that you're researching? What is it that you're looking out for? Go on, sir.
So with plasma therapy, my close friend, the former Minister of Health of China, now the head of the Red Cross, Chen Zhu, was going to send me plasma from China so that I could get infused. And I was very eager to do this because this, although it hasn't been tried in the same way, makes sense in terms of what I know from SARS and other related coronavirus syndromes. However, I was unable to get anybody to agree to allow me to be infused with this unknown plasma from China. It was just too difficult. So we did not go that route. So fortunately, I came out the other end and I'm here, and I am now very firmly pushing forward with plasma trials in New York, where we have an enormous amount of disease. So we have 3 very talented physicians treating people with severe disease, people who are close contacts with people with disease, and healthcare workers, all 3 at risk for COVID. We will know in the next several weeks whether or not this method is going to be useful. If we can demonstrate that it is, the challenge then will be to make certain that we get enough plasma to do this until we have alternatives. We're also in our center trying to repurpose drugs that are known to be safe for other diseases to see whether or not they have activity against SARS coronavirus type 2. And we are also looking at ways in which we can help promote the advance of vaccines, because obviously we need a vaccine. We need it urgently, and we need it soon.
How soon do you think it'll be before the world gets its hands on the first COVID-19 vaccine? There are different lines of technology, research that are being applied. Which one do you think has the best success, and which company or which country at this moment do you think is best placed to come up with the first human vaccine for COVID-19?
Well, there are several countries and several companies that are multinational that are building vaccines. I think, in fact, that many of these vaccines will work, will be effective, and will prevent disease and may even prevent infection, which is even better. Those companies are household names, so it's no trick to find out what they are. And there are many different platforms. Some people are using kill the virus. Some people are using a purely genetic method that results in expression of a protein made by the virus. There are others where they're taking other viruses that are innocuous and modifying them so they insert something that sits on the outside of the virus that looks like the virus that causes COVID. They all seem to target the same region of the SARS coronavirus type 2 that is known as the spike protein, which is the one that allows the virus to attach to cells and to cause disease. The earliest that many people say a vaccine will be available is 18 months from now. I am more optimistic than some of the people who say that. I think we will have something in a year or less. And my rationale for that is that all the phases that we typically take a vaccine through to prove that it's going to be useful are going to be contracted. We're also going to be investing in the development and manufacture before we know which are going to be the winners. So this is a partnership between industry and academia and government, where everybody is sharing some of the risk, because we realize that we cannot wait the usual sort of time frame to bring out a vaccine.
We've spoken about your condition. I want to zoom out for a moment and speak about where you think the world's battle against COVID-19 is going. Is the worst now behind us? Is the worst still to come?
Well, this is very difficult to say. There are so many uncertainties about this virus. So it is continuing to evolve. I don't think this is going to have any impact on the ability of these vaccines that are now being made to prevent disease through the implementation of vaccine strategies globally. Although it's challenging to think about rolling out 9 billion doses of vaccine. Nothing like this has ever been done before. On the other hand, we know that with respiratory viruses, there seems to be a cycling between the northern and the northern and southern hemispheres, so that when something is waxing in the south, it's waning in the north and vice versa. So in the northern hemisphere, and particularly in the Western world, we are beginning to see a peak, if you will, or we think we're at a peak. Some of that may be the physical distancing that we've imposed. I think that's the likely explanation. There may be some small component as we move into warmer months. We don't yet know. We're beginning to see more and more disease in other parts of the world, particularly in the South. And the hope is that people will learn from these experiences that we've had in China, in the US, in particular in New York, and in Italy, where there's been so much devastation. We have learned clearly, when you compare the responses in Sweden with the other Scandinavian countries, as one example, or when you compare Germany versus the US, where the Germans have done extremely well, the other Scandinavian countries have done very well, Sweden has not, that if you do not isolate and you do not test in a rigorous and coherent fashion, then you wind up getting infection that spreads countrywide and causes huge problems. I realize that there is an awful lot of economic devastation that's associated with this, and people do need to survive. They need to eat, and they need to feed themselves. They need to operate, in their cultures. And this is a balancing act that governments are having a great deal of difficulty with.
So we've seen two different approaches at play, Dr. Lipkin. The first is the Indian approach, which is a complete national lockdown. We've now been locked down for almost a month. Then there is the Brazilian approach of President Bolsonaro, where he says, I'll take it in the chest. I used to be a football player. What do you make of these two completely contrarian approaches? One advocating a complete lockdown, the other says, I'll take the flu in the chest.
Well, one of these is informed by science, and the other one is bravado. I think that, the science tells us and we know this from what happened in China, Sweden, Germany, US, Italy, Spain, elsewhere, that if you test and isolate early, you can contain this and limit your damage. Loss of people, morbidity, mortality, economic slide, all of these things will be in better control if, in fact, you take steps early to mitigate the spread of the virus. If you take this sort of approach, say, I'm not worried about it, people are overplaying this, you will have many, many losses of life, and you're going to have enormous morbidity. So I think the science, it's important that politicians, political leaders, listen to scientists, because this is what we're trying to do our best to advise you. Ultimately, the decisions have to be made by the people. We just try to provide you the best data we can. Just like with climate change, there are people who do not believe that our climate is changing, despite all the evidence we provide. And this has enormous ramifications for us. Natural disasters, spread of insects that carry disease, loss of arable land, all sorts of things. But my role is to give you data and to try to make it possible for you to interpret those data.
How closely are you tracking, Dr. Lipkin, what's happening in India? What do you make of how our country is doing in a global comparison?
Well, I'm tracking it to some extent because I have a real affinity for India. I've been going to India since the mid-1990s when I was involved with...
We had you at the India Day conclave as well.
Yes, and before that I was at Think Goa. So it's a beautiful country, resilient people. I love India. The question, and this in fact was made in India. This is from Vaish at Rivoli. So I love India. The problem is this. You have a lot of people who are beginning to push back against the government and saying, I need food, I need this, I need all sorts of things, I need life to return to normalcy. We have to find some way in which we can make it possible for people to live, particularly if they're close to the poverty line, so that children can get educated and so forth, and also control this until such time as we have a vaccine. Ultimately, the route out of this problem that the world is experiencing globally is a vaccine. So what we're trying to do right now is to temporize, to minimize that damage. And there's a lot of pain. It's very easy for me to sit, in the United States in a house where I have plenty of room and no problems. But we have poor people in this country too. They also need to be protected. So it is very, very difficult, particularly in large urban areas where it's very difficult to isolate people.
How long do you think this lockdown in India should continue? What kind of a re-entry strategy would you advocate? As you rightly said, people are now beginning to get frustrated. They've been locked up for more than a month. Many of them in small shanties, in slums, living 8 to 10 in a very small room. There's a limit to how long they can physically endure that. What kind of a re-entry, easing of the lockdown strategy, Dr. Lipkin, would you advocate for India?
So I think that it's impossible for me to tell you a date where you can begin to ease up. What you need to do is you need to assess with epidemiologists whether or not you have flattened the curve, the increase in cases, the increase in mortality, which lags by a week or so, the increase in the number of cases. You need to galvanize those people, who are in your biotech industries, who have the ability to develop personal protective equipment like masks and gloves, as well as testing equipment. If you consider testing on a wide scale, and you can identify clusters of disease early on, then you can just isolate those people and you can begin to move us all back to work, back to school, back to normal life. But there are some things that are going to be difficult and that will lag. So large public events, sporting events, theaters, movies, these kinds of things, very, very difficult because close proximity of people is how this virus thrives. But I think you're going to be able to get back to a situation where people can at least get into jobs as long as they protect themselves appropriately with masks and gloves and try to get some sort of physical distancing. If you're living in a house with 8 people in a very small area, this is going to be very, very challenging.
But when do you think people can go back to the movies? When can they go to a restaurant? When will life, in your view, Dr. Lipkin, come back to the way it used to be before this virus just forced us to hide in our own homes?
When we have a vaccine. Before that, it's going to be it's going to be a series of compromises. So what we have right now is not tenable. It is not sustainable. We recognize that. So what we have to do is find a way to make it possible to find some kind of middle ground. And to move toward that middle ground, we're going to need more testing, more epidemiologists who can actually track new outbreaks. This is how smallpox was eradicated. And the last cases, as you know, were in India. So you have the situation where you would identify a case, you would vaccinate everybody around this case, you would isolate them to make sure that nothing went any further. This is going to be the kind of approach that we're going to have to this particular virus. We may wind up, for example, in a vaccine strategy when vaccine is in short supply, before it really gears up, where we may have to find cases and isolate contacts again, just as we did, decades ago. I hope not.
So you're saying it could take about an year for the vaccine to come out? Until then, we'll have to maintain extreme precautions. Does that mean that there'll be any international travel? Will airlines start flying once again? If they do, how is that possible? Will countries like the United States or China or other countries be okay with people from elsewhere coming in?
I think it's possible. It's going to require testing, personal protective equipment, and an enormous amount of cleaning. So this virus is not airborne. It's not like it floats, several meters in the air and then infects somebody as a result. This is something which is spread by fairly close contact. We're talking about 2 meters. We're talking about people touching what we call fomites, which are objects in the environment that then transfer it. But if you do not touch your face, as many people do all the time, or rub your eyes, or do these other sorts of things, if you find a way that if you cough, you're wearing a mask, or you're coughing like this, we can reduce the risk of transmission. You already have an enormous advantage over the Western world in this. When you greet people, you don't insist on handshakes. You go like so. This is an enormous advantage, and I've been doing that for decades because I know that people spread bacteria and viruses with these handshakes. So this is something, and we put that in the movie Contagion, in fact, where there's this story that Lawrence Fishburne talks about how you transfer microbes with these sort of medieval handshake, which was originally designed to show that you didn't have a sword in your hand or a knife, but instead you had something more lethal. You had COVID-19. So we have to change the way in which we operate. Now, I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but it is doable. And the sooner we do it, the easier it's going to be. There will be a vaccine. Please be hopeful.
Now that you've had COVID-19, are you certain that you have immunity for life? There have been some reports coming from South Korea that people who they thought had COVID-19 had recovered and therefore assumed to have some kind of immunity were reinfected. What do you make of this whole bogey of reinfection? Is that possible? Because if it is, it means that none of us, even if we contact the virus, will have immunity forever.
We don't yet know that fully. We think, based on analogy to other infections, that if you've had COVID-19, it's very unlikely you're going to get it again within a period of at least several months. Hopefully this will carry us through to the point where we have a vaccine that we believe will be very, very effective. Now, it's possible that these people who were thought to have had COVID-19 didn't have it and got it for the first time. Another possibility is that they tested negative, but subsequently, in fact, were found to be positive because they never really went negative. There's variability in the quality of tests And it's very important that the equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in every country validate and ensure that the tests that are being used are accurate. So the sampling has to be appropriate. The test has to be run by people who know what they're doing. These are not foolproof tests. This requires expertise.
You've been very close to the Chinese dispensation. World over, Beijing has come in for immense criticism, including from the President of the United States, where it's now being alleged that China created this virus at a virology laboratory in Wuhan. As one of the leading epidemiologists who are studying the strain of this virus, Dr. Lipkin, do you believe that the coronavirus is a naturally occurring virus, or could this potentially be something made in a virus laboratory in Wuhan?
We have looked at this in great detail. An international group of scientists have examined the sequence, and I was among them who reported this in a very prominent scientific journal about a month and a half ago, where we looked at this particular, this particular rumor. What we found was the following. The closest relationship of this virus genetically is to a virus that came out of a bat. There are regions that are important in this virus for binding to the outside of cells so they can actually infect those cells. This region is not the region that has previously been identified and modified in laboratories to test whether or not it's important in binding the cells. So if in fact it had been modified in the Wuhan Institute for Virology, they would have used a different sequence for that purpose because this was not obvious. And the third thing is the kinds of modifications that we see in this virus that has come out of humans now all over the world suggests that there was some sort of immune pressure that made for it to acquire certain sugar molecules on the outside and things like this that would not have occurred except unless it was being passed somehow either in animals or in people. There's no evidence whatsoever that there was any effort to create something of this sort. There's no evidence that there are animals in which it was passage to create this problem. So I don't think there's any data to support this.
Are you telling your friends in the Chinese government, Dr. Lipkin?
Let me just finish.
Yes.
This emerged just like Ebola emerged in Africa, Nipah emerged in Malaysia, SARS emerged in China, MERS arrived, all the influenzas arrive every year. There are literally 1 million viruses out there in the natural world waiting to be discovered. And some of them spill over into humans. What we need is an international surveillance system so that whenever something does this, we can be on top of it and we can contain the damage. And when I've spoken in the Mumbai conclave and in Goa, I think Goa, that was run by Tehelka, and every chance I get, I preach this because this is the future for us. This is what will keep us secure on the planet. This is what we need. This program is called Gideon. Anybody who wants to hear about this, you can write me. I'm easy to find. It's an international integrated network where people share data, insights, techniques, information, and care for one another to try to protect the world.
You say there are literally dozens of such viruses floating around, and it's only a matter of chance that the virus mutates from being in a bat, jumps a species to come and affect a human being. Do you think this, what we are seeing is a once-in-a-century pandemic? The last time we saw this was the Spanish flu way back in the early part of the 20th century. Or are you concerned that what we've seen this time could happen again and possibly in our lifetimes itself?
I think that we're seeing these much more frequently than we used to.
Why?
And this is a function of many things. Deforestation, population migration, international trade and travel, climate change. All of these things are changing the rate at which these appear. So you've mentioned 1918, but there have been many things since. HIV, Ebola, Marburg, Nipah, West Nile virus, chikungunya, SARS-1, MERS, Lujo. I mean, I've been involved with at least 15 such, potential pandemics. This one is the one that we're thinking about now. I'm not even convinced that it's the worst one that we could confront.
Why not? It's really 4 billion people are locked down. You think things could get worse? Why?
Why do I think things could get worse? In what way? Do I think we could have another pandemic? Absolutely. If we don't change the ways in which we interact with our natural environment, we're going to have this problem continuously. We have, we talked a little bit about climate change. Climate change has resulted in people becoming forced to move, so you have something which used to be restricted in one area which is now in another. We have international trade, which means that something which starts in Central Africa or in South America or in Asia rapidly spreads around the world, just like this did, right? We have people who can no longer find protein, so they wind up eating wild animals and becoming infected by those wild animals. We have very wealthy people who like to keep exotic pets who can infect animals as well. So we are a perfect storm for this. We need to change the way we interact with our natural environment.
So a lot of the reason why the virus is jumping a species is because of things like the wild wet animal markets in China. Are you telling your friends in the Chinese government that, for heaven's sakes, just see the damage you've caused the world, we need to put a stop to this? It's a centuries-old tradition, but given the damage that happened because of the coronavirus, do you think these totally bizarre, at least from an Indian perspective, wild animal markets will now finally come to an end? Because I saw a report from Wuhan which said despite what happened, they just opened the market again.
I have been talking with the Chinese government about this for a very long time. These wild animal markets are not unique to China, by the way. We have them in Africa. We even, believe it or not, we have some of these live animal markets with unusual animals in parts of the United States. So these things must stop. If you look at all the diseases that have emerged that we know about over the past several decades, 70% of these emerging infectious diseases originated in wild animals. So this is not something that is new. It has come to our attention at present because everyone is focused on COVID-19, but we've been talking about this for a very, very long time. But more or less, no one has listened and tried to find ways in which we can contain this risk.
I hope they listen now, because if they don't listen now, I wonder when they ever will. Last time you came on our show, you spoke of the need to wear masks and gloves. A lot of people said that's paranoia. Now virtually all of India, as is the rest of the impacted world, roams around with masks. I ask you now about gloves. Do you think in a few weeks from now, gloves will become important too? Because even with gloves, like was the case with masks, there are two views. There are a whole bunch of people who say it doesn't really matter, because even if you're wearing a glove, you could put it on your mouth and that's the end of that. Will gloves also soon become as important as masks, Dr. Lipkin?
I think gloves are definitely important. What you need to do is there are two ways in which this works. One, as you touch something, you're much less likely to get this virus on your hands. That's number one. Number two, most people who wear gloves become aware that they're wearing a glove, and therefore they don't touch their face. They take the glove off and then they touch their face. If you do that, you're safe, right? So all of these things are prompts that allow us to be more cautious and hopefully to spend more time thinking about ways in which we can keep ourselves and other people safe. In previous years, every time I've gone to Japan during a respiratory tract season, I see people wearing masks. If you had worn a mask in New York 2 months ago, people would think that there was something wrong with you. It was considered bizarre behavior. It is not bizarre anymore, because at least in New York State, it is now the law. As of 8 p.m. 2 days ago, you had to wear a mask if you were out in public. So I think the world is changing. I wish it had changed earlier. We would have lost fewer people, and we would not be in as deep an economic slide as we are, but better late than never.
What are your current epidemiological models telling you about the kind of devastation you think coronavirus will cause in time to come? Can you give us your baseline scenario, your most likely scenario, your worst case, your best case scenario?
You see, the best case scenario is that everyone does what they're supposed to do and everything flattens out and we begin to improve. Then we have a second wave, which unfortunately comes up, in fall of this year. But I hope that at that point we have drugs that are better for controlling disease and that we are closer to having the vaccine that we are all, eagerly anticipating. The worst case scenario is that people open up prematurely. We see a big explosion in the amount of virus, the number of people infected, and the morbidity and mortality. And I shudder to think about what those consequences would be. So we are right now in the U.S. trying to persuade everyone to let the data tell us what to do. So if things begin to taper down and they stay flat for a period of several weeks, then we can begin to relax even further. But during the meantime, what we're trying to do is to find some middle road that will allow us to get some people back to work, move us back toward normalcy with the understanding that we're not going to get exactly where we need to be.
What do you make of how Donald Trump is handling this crisis?
That is not going to be a successful conversation because there's nothing that I can say that is going to work well. If I say he's doing well, my colleagues are going to disagree with me. If I say he's not doing well, then he's not going to listen to me anymore. What I have to do is just provide the best evidence I can for why this path makes sense as opposed to that path. And that's the approach.
We saw some very scary scenes of healthcare workers standing on the road with pro-Trump supporters virtually running cars past them. That was called in some senses America's Tiananmen moment. And there was lots of concern about the Republican Party led by its president virtually telling people, especially in Democrat-run states, to rebel against the governors.
I think that this is a very dangerous thing. I agree.
I see you're being very guarded and very cautious about what you say. In conclusion, Dr. Lipkin, for everyone there's life AC and BC, after Corona and before Corona. Now that you are hopefully in the AC stage, the after Corona stage of your life, how is this stage of your life, Dr. Ian Lipkin, going to be different from the BC stage of your life?
Not at all. I do the same thing I do all the time. I work, I try to reduce morbidity and mortality. I'm so sorry that I was not able to come to the conclave in New Delhi because they literally shut the flights the day that I was due to come.
We didn't have the conclave in Delhi, Dr. Lipkin. We cancelled the conclave down. So you still owe us one. And we're doing this virtual conversation, but hopefully we'll get you down sometime soon.
I will be back, and I have offered my services to Prime Minister Modi, just as I do to President Xi, who I've met, who I was found very impressive. If there's any way that I can be helpful to you and your government, I will do my
China's being criticized quite a lot for not being transparent, for hiding numbers, for fudging, for not informing. You seem very, very soft on China, and I wonder why, Dr. Lipkin.
I'm not a politician. I'm a humanist and a scientist. My job is to collect data, to explain it in a way that it can be used by people who need to make decisions that benefit people. That is my role in life. And it's not to be a politician.
Ordinarily, at the end of a stimulating conversation, I would have stuck my hand out and said, thank you. You're now saying that's not possible, so I'll do a virtual high five. Thank you very much, Dr. Ian Lipkin, for joining us. Oh, and a namaste. Absolutely, that's the way. Let's just go back to our Indian roots. Why go down the New York roads when you can go back to our Indian roots? So we'll say a big namaste. Thank you so much. We tried for many days to get you back on our station. We are delighted that you agreed. I'm happy that you're recovering well, and you've also really laid out your experiences and all the knowledge and experience that you have about how to deal with this pandemic. Dr. Ian Lipkin, it's been an absolute pleasure and a delight to have you with us on the Newstrack. Thank you for joining us in India Today. Goodbye.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.